I think I'm here. Am I here? Good. Hi, this is Willard Spiegelman. I'm speaking to you today from 107 Water Street in Stonington, Connecticut, the home, or one of the homes, of James Merrill, the excellent American poet of the second half of the 20th century, and as I hope to suggest, a poet for today as well. This charming apartment looks pretty much the same as it did in 1995, the year of Merrill's death. At that time, he deeded the property to the Stonington Village Improvement Association, which supervises it now. For the past 25 years, under the guidance of the James Merrill House organization, this apartment at 107 Water Street has been used as a place for writers' residencies. Over 80 writers have lived here, working in the space that he inhabited and where he created much of his life's great work. For more information, please consult our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org, and please feel free to make a contribution to our organization in order to supplement his benefaction, a great benefaction, with your benefactions. My pleasurable job today is less to describe the remarkable setting I'm in than to introduce you to the life and even more the work of the man who made all of this possible. And to help, my other job, to help those of you who may have been timid about approaching poetry all these years. Don't worry, poetry should be a source of pleasure, not anxiety. And now that it's no longer really taught in schools and is no longer a vibrant part of American culture, many people have anxieties. I'll start, as I always did when I was teaching university students, with some short, seemingly easy poems that can be used as an introduction to an artist's work. Every great poet, said Wordsworth, creates the taste by which he is to be enjoyed. And all great poets also teach us how to read them. The best commentary on a poem by James Merrill is another poem by James Merrill. And I hope my short examples will encourage you to dig more deeply and more widely into the work of this extraordinary artist. James Merrill was born into a wealthy, socially prominent New York family. His father, Charles, was a self-made man, famous for, as they say, bringing Wall Street to Main Street after World War I, in which he served as a pilot. He founded a little brokerage house that is now called Merrill Lynch. You may know of that. He had already married once before. Young Jimmy had two elder half-siblings, Doris and Charles, the first of whom was the Merrill child with the business sense, the second of whom founded the Commonwealth School in Boston and became a leader in private secondary education. Charles Sr. met and then married a woman named Helen Ingram, a Southern journalist who gave birth to James Ingram Merrill in New York City on March 3rd, 1926. The boy was surrounded by luxury, a townhouse in Greenwich Village. Years later, this actually was blown up accidentally by radical weathermen who were living there, and you can still go visit the place on West 11th Street. A place in Southampton, another in Palm Beach, and of course, many servants. Later in life, Merrill confessed that those servants, his governess, the cook, the chauffeur, the maids, the gardeners, had lives that seemed more immediate, more vibrant, more real than those of his parents and their society friends. His parents were always having parties and entertaining anyway and didn't see their son that often. In some ways, these details may make Merrill seem like an unlikely candidate for relevance in 2020, when life in America is more tumultuous, fractious, and sensitive to social and economic inequalities than in earlier times. I'd like to show, to the contrary, that like all great poets, Merrill remains continually relevant, and that even a poet who by his own admission was basically apolitical has much to teach us. He grew up, really, as an only child, and when his parents separated and then divorced, Charlie having a roving eye, when their little son was 11 and then 13, He suffered the great calamity of his life, as many children of divorce do, and he was forever sensitive as a person and as a poet to conflicts, separations, dualisms, or duels, of many kinds, and the opposing impulse to reconcile people or ideas or feelings, to bring things together. And that's what poets do. They unite things, sometimes through rhymes, and Merrill was a master of rhyming, and always through figures of speech, a metaphor, a simile, or other such tropes and comparisons and turns, always being the best means of joining things that have previously been thought separate. It's wonderful to see that a masterpiece from his middle years, which I won't talk about, is called The Broken Home. It deals with the breakdown of his family, his home, both the people and the actual house, and it does so in the form of a medley of poems, a medley specifically of sonnets, 7 14-line poems, all slightly different from one another, all bearing resemblances to one another. Poems are distinguished from prose. This is the elementary Poetry 101 part of the lecture. Poems are distinguished from prose by two things. Let's call them music and metaphor. By the first, I mean simply the formal and sonic arrangements of words in lines on the page. In the case of someone like Merrill, a consummate craftsman, we can always ascertain why the poem is configured as it is. As Coleridge once said, good prose is words in the best order, and good poetry is the best words in the best order. Merrill loved complicated formal arrangements, not only for their own sake, but also for how they mirror the mind in the act of discovering new things about itself and about the world. He mastered English prosody, verse techniques, early on. Remember, until Walt Whitman began the revolution in 1855, that gradually eroded iambic pentameter as the basis of English verse. This had gone forward from Chaucer for almost 500 years, and replaced it with what has become known as free verse, although there's nothing free about it. The majority of all English poems had recognizable rhymes and rhythms, which many readers today still use as the only criterion for knowing whether what they are reading or hearing is a poem. Speaking of free verse, it just occurs to me, today is the birthday of another great 20th century poet, master of free verse, Dr. William Carlos Williams. That's just an added aside. So these are the principles of music, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. The other, perhaps more important factor in poetry is metaphor, simile, the whole range or panoply of ways in which a poet says one thing by means of another. You can be a great novelist or playwright without this gift, but you cannot be a great poet. In an interview once, Merrill, who was often accused of being icy in his formality or too rigid and impersonal, said that he found it unnecessary to state one's feelings in a poem. Rather, he said, you might describe your room or a picture or a scene and allow your feelings and your personality to appear as a result of what you are seeing reflected or mimed back to you. Above all, poets have a love of language. That love usually starts early, and it starts by listening and then by reading. Merrill remembered reading or hearing as a young child a line of dialogue from a play by Philip Barry. The line is, "Father is in the drawing room, sampling the port." He thought, the port is where Daddy keeps his boat. A sample has something to do with mother's sewing box. Already you see parents and language were going together. And in a notebook from early childhood, he again was thinking linguistically in ways that brought his parents back together. When he observed of a scene in Florida, what heavenly colors and what swell fish. You've got the feminine touch in heavenly, you've got the manly touch in swell. Already the young boy was aware of different registers in language. Merrill was a master craftsman who could not avoid playing with language. Such play is what one of his important influences, the Anglo-American poet W.H. Auden, called the most promising sign of a bright future for a poet. Auden would ask aspiring writers about their vocational dreams and qualifications and ambitions. If someone said, I like doing crosswords, I like playing anagrams, he was more inclined to give his blessing than if someone said he or she wanted to express ideas or feelings. This reminds me of another exchange between Edgar Degas, the painter, and his friend Stéphane Mallarmé. Degas said to Mallarmé, you know, I think I'd like to write poems. I have all kinds of ideas I want to express. Mallarmé shook his head and said, no, a poem, my dear Degas, is made not with great ideas, but with words. He was right. After Merrill's death, J.D. McClatchy, his friend, neighbor, and one of his literary executors, was going through Merrill's vast library. Almost every book was filled with marginalia or inserted pages of notes or scribblings all over it. Sandy said, I knew Jimmy was addicted to language, but I never knew the full extent of the addiction. He was, in other words, a graphomaniac, if that's a word. The most delicious piece that I recall from McClatchy's description was a volume of poetry of Dylan Thomas. On the title page, in block letters, the book announced the collected poems of Dylan Thomas. Merrill had gazed at the 11 letters of the poet's name, and at the bottom of the page, he rearranged them in pencil into an appropriate anagram. Hot Ladies Man. HOTLADYSMA, men. He could not help himself from playing around with language. At the Lawrenceville School at Amherst College, he won the major literary prizes. After college graduation, he did a stint in the US Army, and then he decamped for Europe in order to escape from his family, to live openly as a gay man, to see the treasures of Western civilization that he had previously only read about, and to become a serious poet. He never needed to have a job, but he worked harder than almost anyone I have ever known. The poems started coming, and they stopped only on his deathbed in Tucson, where he was still fiddling with language on pieces of paper. His oeuvre includes novels, plays, a wonderful, stunning memoir, incisive short essays, some travel writing, and many volumes of poetry, at the center of which is the epic poem called The Changing Light at Sandover, which had its inception in the very room from which I'm speaking to you 65 years ago. This is the dining room in the apartment. It took decades to complete. It began as a series of, I'm not making this up, transcriptions of messages received from voices from another world and taken down by hand via the crackpot mechanism of a Ouija board. Many readers thought that this vast work was a betrayal of its author's gifts. Others consider it a masterpiece. I'll let you dip in and find out for yourself. Meanwhile, to get a flavor of Merrill's special gifts, let me introduce him to you via 3 shorter poems, a genre at which he always excelled. His main subjects, as he said, were what he referred to as his chronicles of love and loss. His poems are sometimes autobiographical, sometimes taking liberties with actual facts, but this doesn't matter. A poem can be autobiographical at one remove, and we must never assume that a simple I or me in a poem is a literal representation of its maker. At the heart of all of Merrill's work, small and large, was the desire to create or to examine, to formulate, to reproduce what we might call a self. What is a self, or a temperament, or an identity? Of what is it composed? What is one's identity? Is it inherited or created? Are we our bodies? Do we have a soul separate from our body? These can be heavy, philosophical, speculative questions. And Merrill was the lightest, the most scintillating, the most Mozartian of poets. And heavy philosophizing was as far from his thoughts as you might imagine, which does not mean that these issues do not exist. Remember, one of my great truths that I try to communicate to students, especially in art, simplicity is not the same as superficiality, and difficulty is not the same as depth. Something apparently simple can be deep. Something that looks complicated and heady can, in fact, be shallow. Let me begin. These are all poems from the middle of his career to the end. Let me begin with a short lyric called Santo. And I'm particularly fond of this because Merrill allowed me to publish it in a literary quarterly that I edited for 30 years. So I was grateful to him for many things, but for this too. A Santo, or Santo, as you may know, is a painted wooden figurine found in Mexico, also in the American Southwest, usually of a Catholic saint. Merrill, for all of his big city sophistication, loved folk art. And I'm surrounded by much of that in this apartment here, which you can come visit when people can come visit any place. Merrill loved folk art for the ways in which it could embody complex truths. He was the one who sent me, when I first went to Santa Fe decades ago, to the Alexander Girard collection at the Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe. He loved that place. Here's the poem, and I hope that Bergen has flashed on the screen an image of a Santo. You can look them up online if you want. Santo. Francisco on his shelf, wreathed in dusty wax roses, for weeks and weeks hadn't been himself, making no day come true by answering a prayer, just dully sitting there. What did our grandma do? She painted his beard black and rinsed the roses clean, then hid his rags in half a new red satin cloak, renaming him Martin. Next week, the baby spoke. Juan sent a photograph on board his submarine, and Concho went to cook downtown at a hotel. The sick white dog got well, and that was all it took. What could be simpler or more charming? We've got 5 4-line stanzas with 3 beats per line in a wonderful, quite easy rhyming pattern, A, B, B, A, as we call it. Merrill loved this stanzaic pattern. How come? Well, he loved all stanzas. Stanza is the Italian word for room, and in a poem, a stanza is a little room. I remind you of all the different stanzas in The Broken Home, the poem I referred to a little while ago. Stanzas in which things are being joined and things are being separated. Rooms are about enclosures, and the A rhyme, the outer rhyme, encloses the tidy B rhyme, making a comfortable pattern with things joined and things separated. But notice in this poem, the rhyme is not quite exact. He was too much of a master to rely solely on the rules. He knew when to bend them. Notice the sly words photograph and half. that rhyme with each other, but break the form just a little in those stanzas that describe the saint's renovation. And cloak rhymes with spoke, and Martine rhymes with clean, as well as submarine. The poet wants things regular, but not too regular. He wants to toss a little informality, like a spice, into the mix. He wants to give us surprises, as well as to fulfill our expectations. Even more, think of the main idea. That's a pretentious word, but think of the main idea of the poem. And it's not so much an idea as a cliche, which the poet asks us to consider. I bet this was one of the origins of the poem. The poet was thinking of how to revitalize an old truism or an old trite expression. The saint hadn't been himself. What does that mean? Who, we ask, might he have been, if not himself? If you are not yourself one day, what do you do to re-become yourself? Think of that other related cliche, to find yourself. Is yourself something outside you? Well, in this case, perhaps. The outside is the all-important thing. It's not just a veneer. You want a renovation? You want a restoration? Try a new style. Redecorate. Get a haircut. Or get a new paint job. Take a new name. And then, voila, you are a new person, a new man, a new woman, a new saint. And the miracles will come forth. As the contemporary philosopher Slavoj Žižek, whom I'm sure James Merrill did not know of, echoing Oscar Wilde, whom I know James Merrill did know of, once urged us, if you want to show your true self, put on the right mask. Next, let's consider a late poem. This is from Merrill's last volume, whose title is the first clue to its conundrums or difficulties. I'm not even sure how we're supposed to say it. B-O-D-Y or body. We have the small letters there. Letters also are known as characters. And characters are a key, letters are a key to identity or character, and especially to the relationship of body and soul, of the outside and the inside. In Santo, putting on some paint guaranteed a new person. In body, or B-O-D-Y, Merrill takes a theatrical metaphor and goes further with it, stretching it out. Look closely at the letters. Can you see entering stage right? That means on the left-hand side if you're sitting in the audience. Can you see entering stage right, then floating full, then heading off so soon? How like a little coal-rimmed moon, O plots her course from B to D, as Y, unanswered, knocks at the stage door. Looked at too long, words fail, phase out. Ask, now that body shines no longer, by what light you learn these lines and what the B and D stood for. This is more complicated than Santo, but body nevertheless engages us, sort of, with regard to a similar subject. In the first line, I hear a faint echo, who knows whether I'm right or wrong, oh say can you see? Oh say can you see? Not as it turns out, by the dawn's early light, but in nocturnal moonlight. This is a riddle poem. And Merrill loved riddles as he also loved puzzles. It's playful and serious at the same time. B and D are little characters. They surround O and they precede Y in a little drama, which is really a big drama. What do they stand for, these mirror images of each other? And I'm sure that Merrill did this in small and minuscule letters rather than caps, because B and D are in fact mirror images of each other where they would not be if they were capitalized. What do these mirror images stand for? What are they? Birth and death, of course. And then why does any of this happen? That question, the important question, remains unanswered, unanswerable. Oh, a character or a sigh, an exclamation or an exhalation of wonder. Oh, the full moon of our individual identity is rimmed, as an actor would be, with eye makeup, and it moves inexorably across the heavens from birth to death until the body shines no longer, and the whole drama of life from birth to death, whose lines we learn as we enact it, and whose path we trace as both participants on our own and as observers or readers of others or people at a play. It's all eventually snuffed out. I'm taken, as I was with Santo, by Merrill's interesting rhymes in these 2 5-line stanzas. There's connection, unification, and also separation, both within and between the stanzas. The first and last lines of each stanza rhyme, containing the middle 3. Lines 3 and 4 make for a tight couplet. And then there are the nonce lines, the ones that stand out, number 2 in each stanza, that sort of rhyme with each other. This is another separate pairing, this time one of virtual opposites. Full is the antithesis of fail, but it is its partner as well. To be full, the poem seems to say, or invites us to hear, to be full is all very well and good, but it leads always to failure. The moon waxes, the moon wanes. It rises, it sets. We live, we die. The play is over, the curtain comes down, and darkness overcomes us all. That's kind of grim, but it's also, I think, rather snappy in its cleverness. I'm sure Merrill was fiddling with the individual letters, writing them down, B-O-D-Y, and then thinking what to make of it or how to make something of it. Finally, I'm going to turn to another short poem called Domino. Santo unpacked a cliche about being oneself, unpacked a cliche to say something about identity. Body played with typography and with the metaphor of drama, or the stage, to suggest the rise and fall of a human life. This last 3-stanza poem proves that Merrill, for all of his shimmering and witty playfulness, was also aware of the social truths and the political realities that enabled and underlay his charmed existence. He was aware of them and was also able to comment slyly on them. Some people have called it a neo-Marxist poem. It also has theological undertones. Believe me, for those of you who don't range around in the depths or the morass of literary scholarship, there's much to be said, much has been said from every point of view about everything in the world. Some of it more heavy-handed, some of it more believable than some other parts of it. I'd say, less ham-fistedly or heavy-handedly, that the poem is a defense of sweetness in a bitter world and a proof of the necessity of art in trying times. Here's the poem, Domino. Delicious, white, refined is all that I was raised to be, whom feeling for the word plus crystal rudiments of mind still keep, however stirred, from wholly melting in the tea. Far, far away, men cut the sea-wide, sea-green fields of cane. Often a child's lament filled the infested hut. Doña Pilar flew back for Lent. Had she been inhumane? The better to appraise his mess, history's health freak begs that such as we be given up. Outpouring bitterness rewards the drainer of the cup. He'll miss those sparkling dregs. Santo is a third-person anecdotal poem. Body is a second-person poem, giving commands and asking questions. Domino is all in the first person. Its speaker is presenting himself. Its speaker knows himself. But all three of these lyrics address issues of human identity and about ways of being in the world. Domino is a riff. The title refers to the table sugar we all use. Perhaps there's a picture of it now on the screen. It may also playfully allude to the playing tiles with white dots on a black surface. And of course, if you want to be really clever, you hear the Latin word dominus, lord or master, behind it as well. You might also want to consider some multiple suggestions in some of the words. Most obvious one is refined. Merrill was refined. Sugar is refined. What about Doña Pilar, whose name means pillar, which, if you want to scratch the surface and become theological and consider perhaps other references in the poem to church sacraments like penance or the Eucharist, pillar may suggest Christ's pillar of the flagellation. And of course, mess is a reminder of a Catholic Mass. Christian doctrine, plus a radical or a more general political concern for the exploitation of workers, all of that is here, sort of sotto voce. Mostly, the poem is Merrill's way of acknowledging his own status as someone from an outdated class who nevertheless, he would like to say, has a role to play in the greater world. And at the end, even history's health nut, whether that's a Maoist revolutionary or a New Age diet freak, or both combined in one person, even history's health nut has got to admit that the sparkling dregs, all that remains of the useless, unnutritious sugar of the title, have left a sweetness that no real or healthy nutriment can provide. In other words, sweetness may be more than merely a silly, unnecessary addition to substance. I'd like to think that Merrill is here thinking of the role that art, especially art that on first glance might be deemed socially irrelevant or superficial or ornamental, has to play in difficult, even dangerous times. And I'm reminded of a wonderful line from Dickens, Charles Dickens' most revolutionary novel, Hard Times. Against the mind-numbing demands of utilitarian education promoted by one of the villains in the novel, Mr. Gradgrind, wonderful name, Mr. Gradgrind, who says, "What I want is facts, facts." And the rampant capitalistic economics of Mr. Bounderby, Dickens gives us the figure is a modest, minor character, the factory owner, Mr. Sleary, who is the lisping owner of a touring circus, who reminds us people must, spelled out muff, people must be amused, squire, somehow. People must be amused, squire, somehow. They can't be always a-working, nor yet they can't be always a-learning. Domino, like the entire output of James Merrill, is a reminder of the ever-present need for amusement, of what Robert Frost meant when he said that poetry is play. Poetry is play for mortal stakes, even or especially in hard, grim times. These 20th century poems are always fresh, always nourishing. That is the end of my remarks. I will remind you, and we can have some questions if people wish to ask them. But before we do it, let me remind you that our next event here at the Merrill House is on Saturday, September the 26th at 5 p.m. with the current Merrill House scholar, writer in residence, Walt Hunter. And he's going to be talking about the wonderful subject of writers and their houses, writers in their rooms. And then a week later, on Friday, October the 2nd, we will have the annual James Merrill Lecture with the great American poet Carl Phillips from Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you very much. Bergen, you can take it away.